My mom wants you at dinner tonight. That was the text Mason sent 24 hours before our wedding. I expected a glamorous family meal. Instead, between crystal glasses and polished smiles, his mother slid supposedly routine papers toward me to sign. By 3 in the morning, the truth was clear. They did not need a bride. They needed a signature to save their rotting empire. By morning, I decided to destroy them. My name is Daphne Stone. I am 34 years old. I stood in front of the tall mirror in my hotel suite and looked at the woman staring back at me. She was calm. She was independent. She was a woman who had built a concrete fortress of a life with her own 2 hands. I did not come from a lineage of old money. I did not have a trust fund waiting for me when I turned 21. There were no ancestral estates or summer homes in my background. Every single thing I possessed, I had earned through relentless work, sharp intuition, and a refusal to be anything less than entirely self-sufficient. Tomorrow, I was supposed to marry Mason Voss. Mason was the golden child of Bracken Point, Georgia. He was the flashy, charismatic heir to the Bell Meridian Hospitality Group. His family dealt in the currency of luxury. They orchestrated high-end weddings, exclusive galas, and society events that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. They were the architects of perfect days. The Voss family cultivated an image of modern American aristocracy. They were wealthy, they were polite, and they were steeped in local tradition. But beneath the polished silver and the designer suits, there was a quiet, insidious arrogance. They looked down on anyone who lacked a pedigree. To them, my lack of lineage was a cute little defect. They treated me like a rescue animal they were graciously allowing into their pristine home. They liked that I was successful, but they loved that I was not one of them, because it meant they could always feel superior. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my phone lit up on the dressing table. It was a message from Mason. It read, "My mom wants you at dinner tonight." There was no apology for the short notice. There was no consideration for the fact that a bride might want to rest 24 hours before her wedding. When I called him, he brushed off my hesitation with that smooth, practiced charm of his. He told me it was just an intimate pre-wedding meal. He said we only needed to finalize a few small details, and that his mother insisted. I agreed, mostly because fighting with Evelyn Voss was an exhausting endeavor I wanted to avoid on the eve of my marriage. I chose a simple, elegant silk slip dress. It was unpretentious, but beautiful. I drove my own car down the winding coastal highway toward Marigold House. Marigold House was the crown jewel of the Bell Meridian Empire. It was a sprawling, breathtaking oceanfront estate designed to make wealthy brides feel like royalty. The driveway was lined with ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss, leading up to a grand entrance that screamed generational wealth. But the moment I walked through the heavy wooden doors, I felt a distinct shift in the atmosphere. The air inside the grand foyer did not feel like the eve of a joyous celebration. It felt suffocating. The venue was usually a perfectly running machine, but tonight, the energy was fractured and chaotic. Staff members hurried past me with their heads down and their jaws locked in tight lines. No one offered me a customary glass of champagne. No one smiled. I paused by the archway leading to the grand ballroom. The venue manager was pacing furiously near the columns. He was clutching his radio like a lifeline, his knuckles completely white. He was whispering frantically to someone on the other end, his voice tight with panic. He kept repeating phrases about a morning inspection and missing safety clearances. Down the hall, near the massive catering kitchen, the swinging doors were propped open. 2 executive chefs were having a heated argument with a supplier. I could hear the supplier demanding a cash transfer before he would unload the premium seafood delivery. The chefs were shouting back, complaining about frozen accounts and begging for a 24-hour grace period. This was not the immaculate Voss standard. This was the sound of a sinking ship. I kept my face perfectly neutral and walked past the chaos toward the private dining room. The private dining room was a masterclass in intimidating elegance. A massive crystal chandelier cast a cold, sharp light over a long mahogany table set for only 3 people. Evelyn Voss was already seated at the head of the table. She looked like a woman who had never experienced a moment of doubt in her entire life. Her posture was rigidly perfect. Her smile was a weapon carefully concealed behind a polite veneer. Mason sat to her right, swirling a glass of deep red wine, looking completely untroubled by the frantic energy buzzing through the rest of the house. I took my seat to the left of Evelyn. Almost immediately, the subtle, polished insults began. Evelyn took a slow sip of her wine and looked me up and down. Her eyes rested on my silk dress. She offered a smile that did not reach her eyes. She said it was so refreshing how I embraced such a pedestrian style. She said most women entering a family with their standing would feel the desperate need to try so much harder, to prove they belonged. She told me it was charming that I did not even attempt to match the grandeur of the Voss name. She was heavily implying that I should be on my knees thanking them for allowing me to step into their world. I did not take the bait. I kept my silence. Over the years, I had learned that silence was the most effective shield against manipulators. I focused my attention on my food and observed the dynamics at play. I looked at Mason, expecting him to intervene. I expected the man who claimed to love me to defend me against his mother, but he said nothing. He simply watched the exchange with a faint, satisfied smirk on his lips. He was not uncomfortable with her condescension. He enjoyed it. He loved the narrative that he was the benevolent savior lifting me up from my ordinary, working-class roots. He liked being the prince who gave the commoner a seat at the royal table. My silence was not submission, but they were too arrogant to realize that I was cataloging everything. The dinner dragged on through 3 agonizing courses. The conversation was dominated by Evelyn listing the names of the important local politicians and wealthy socialites who would be attending the ceremony tomorrow. She spoke of the wedding not as a union of 2 people, but as a corporate networking event designed to showcase the power of the Belle Meridian brand. As the waitstaff quietly cleared away our dessert plates, the atmosphere in the room subtly shifted. The pleasantries evaporated. Evelyn dabbed the corners of her mouth with a crisp linen napkin. She folded her hands on the table and leaned forward just a fraction of an inch. Her tone became light, airy, and dangerously casual. She told me there was one tiny administrative detail we needed to take care of tonight. She waved her manicured hand dismissively, as if waving away a fly. She said it was just a standard vendor confirmation form that required my signature before the ceremony could proceed tomorrow morning. She looked me right in the eyes, her expression totally unreadable. She said I had to understand that our family has more assets and more professional procedures than I might think. She claimed it was just routine paperwork for the event operations, something they did for every major gathering at Marigold House to ensure seamless logistics. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely still. The frantic energy I had witnessed in the hallways, the hushed arguments in the kitchen, the venue manager sweating over an inspection, and now this sudden, urgent need for a signature on the eve of my wedding. The pieces were starting to align, and the picture they formed was deeply unsettling. The golden heir and his regal mother were looking at me with expectant eyes, waiting for me to blindly accept their narrative. But beneath the crystal and the wine, the stench of desperation was undeniable. I stared at Evelyn. I noted the slight tightness around her mouth. It was a micro-expression that betrayed a hidden anxiety she was trying desperately to conceal. She was a woman accustomed to total obedience, yet her fingers were gripping her linen napkin a little too tightly. I shifted my gaze to Mason. My charming, confident fiancé was suddenly sitting extremely still. He had stopped swirling his wine. His eyes were fixed on my face, watching my reaction with an intensity that bordered on predatory. They did not view me as a bride. They viewed me as a solution to a problem I did not yet understand. The grand dining room of Marigold House no longer felt like a place of celebration. It felt like an interrogation room draped in silk and bathed in candlelight. They were waiting for me to nod, to smile, to be the naive, grateful outsider they assumed I was. They believed I would be so blinded by the sparkling allure of the Voss family name that I would sign away whatever they placed in front of me without a second thought. Evelyn folded her hands together, resting them on the pristine white tablecloth. The diamonds on her fingers caught the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. throwing sharp little fractures of light across the room. She began a monologue that sounded heavily rehearsed, something she had probably delivered to society reporters and charity board members for decades. She spoke of the heavy mantle of family tradition. She droned on about brand reputation, painting their hospitality empire not just as a business, but as a vital, breathing pillar of the community. She looked at me with a gaze that felt incredibly heavy, demanding a sort of religious reverence for her last name. She said that marrying into her world meant adopting an entirely new set of responsibilities. It meant learning to operate not as an individual woman with her own life, but as a living extension of a legacy. She used words like duty, presentation, and synergy, weaving a web of obligation before we had even reached the coffee course. Mason leaned over and poured himself another measure of dark red wine. He smoothly picked up exactly where his mother left off, playing the role of the pragmatic, deeply caring partner. He placed his hand over mine, his palm feeling slightly damp against my skin. He told me our future would be so beautifully seamless if we just handled these boring administrative hurdles tonight. Tomorrow is going to be an absolute whirlwind, he said, his voice dropping into that soothing, persuasive register he used when closing a difficult client. He insisted that between the hairstylists, the photographers, and the 200 guests arriving by early afternoon, I would not have a single second to breathe. He framed his request as an act of profound protection, a way to shield his beautiful bride from logistical headaches on her special day. Evelyn did not wait for my verbal agreement. She reached down beside her chair and produced a thick, cream-colored leather portfolio. She pushed it across the polished wood of the table until it rested directly in front of my empty dessert plate. She unclasped it with a sharp metallic click. Inside was a stack of documents, neatly aligned and fastened with a heavy silver clip. She tapped her perfectly manicured index finger against the bottom of the top page. She told me to just sign right there on the dotted line, and perhaps initial the next 2 pages. She breezily dismissed the thick stack as standard event operations paperwork. She claimed they were simply liability waivers for the valet company, vendor confirmations for the florists, and final aesthetic approvals for the imported table linens. I kept my expression soft, agreeable, and entirely blank. I nodded slowly, reaching out to pull the portfolio closer to my chest. My fingers brushed the heavy, expensive bond paper. The top sheet was indeed a standard vendor agreement, complete with the elegant Bell Meridian letterhead stamped in gold foil. But as I slid my thumb down to flip to the second page, the texture of the paper changed. The subtle weight of it was entirely different from a standard invoice. I lifted the corner just enough to catch a glimpse of the text hiding beneath the decoy forms. My eyes scanned the dense, single-spaced paragraphs. There were no mentions of orchids, champagne tiers, or valet schedules. It was pure, unadulterated legal text. My gaze locked onto a bolded heading near the top of the hidden page. It read, Crescent Ridge Capital. I knew that name intimately, in my line of work, dealing with corporate recovery, audit trails, and risk management. Crescent Ridge Capital was notorious. They were not a traditional bank that handed out friendly business loans to healthy companies. They were a predatory lending firm, the exact kind of institution desperate executives turned to when every other financial door had been slammed shut. They provided bridge loans at exorbitant interest rates, loans that usually required massive collateral, total asset liquidation clauses, and ironclad personal guarantees. A freezing wave washed over my entire body, settling deep into my bones, but I did not let a single muscle in my face twitch. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, but my breathing remained perfectly steady. I let the top page fall back into place, smoothly covering the financial death warrant they had just tried to slip past me. I looked up, letting a warm, slightly bashful smile spread across my face. I pulled my hand away from the leather portfolio and rested it gracefully in my lap. I told them I was so incredibly flattered by their trust in me, but I simply could not sign anything tonight. I injected a perfect amount of naive, girlish romanticism into my voice. I explained that I had a very specific, sentimental vision for the morning, I wanted the photographer to capture the exact moment we signed all our official documents together. I painted a vivid picture of the two of us, dressed in our wedding attire, signing the marriage license and the final venue approval side by side in the sunlit bridal suite. I said it would make the most beautiful, meaningful spread for our first wedding album. I looked directly at Mason, widening my eyes slightly, and asked if we could please save this mundane task for that special, documented moment. The reaction across the table was instantaneous, though microscopic. Evelyn stiffened. Her spine went entirely rigid, and the polite, welcoming smile on her face froze into a tight, unnatural grimace. The hand resting on the table twitched, her fingers curling slightly inward. She had prepared for resistance, perhaps even annoyance, but she had not prepared for a refusal based on shallow wedding aesthetics. Mason saw his mother losing her ironclad composure. He let out a loud, forced laugh that echoed awkwardly against the silk-lined dining room walls. He quickly reached over and pulled the portfolio away from me, snapping the leather cover shut with a bit too much force. He told his mother that I was absolutely right. He said they should not bog down the romance of the evening with vendor contracts and logistics. He was playing the indulgent, agreeable fiancé, but his eyes were darting nervously between the closed folder and my face. He was trying to gauge if I suspected anything beneath the surface. They were desperate for my signature, completely starved for the lifeline it represented, but they could not push the issue now without shattering the illusion of a casual, routine request. Forcing me to sign a loan document under the guise of florist approvals would ruin the elegant, untouchable facade they relied on. I stood up, smoothing down my silk dress, announcing that I should head back to the hotel to get my beauty sleep before the big day. As I reached for my purse, I casually bumped the edge of the heavy mahogany table with my hip. The leather portfolio slid a few inches, its metal clasp falling open just enough to expose the papers inside. I fumbled with my phone, pretending to drop it near the folder. In one fluid, practiced motion, I activated my camera. I kept the screen incredibly dim and ensured the flash was entirely off. As I bent down to pick up my phone, I angled the lens toward the exposed bottom edges of the thick document stack. I snapped 3 rapid, entirely silent photos. I made sure to capture the notary block, the alphanumeric loan file code printed in the footer, and the trailing edge of the attached asset schedule. I slipped the phone securely back into my purse before Mason even had time to stand up and pull out my chair. We walked out of the dining room together. The stifling, heavy silence between us was masked by the ambient noise of the estate preparations. Mason kissed my cheek at the valet stand, his lips feeling cold and unyielding against my skin. He promised he would see me at the altar, his voice tight. As I waited under the grand awning for the valet to bring my car around, a young assistant came rushing out of the main office doors. She looked completely frazzled, her hair falling out of a messy bun, her face pale. She was clutching a massive stack of manila folders against her chest. She took a sharp turn and nearly collided with me, dropping a few papers onto the cobblestone driveway. I immediately knelt down to help her gather them. She babbled a breathless apology, saying she was completely overwhelmed with the last-minute seating chart changes and supplier invoices. She frantically handed me a blue operational folder, thanking me profusely for my help, and then sprinted off toward the catering kitchen before I could correct her mistake. I stood under the warm glow of the carriage lamps and opened the blue folder. It was not a seating chart. It was an internal accounting summary, printed just an hour ago. The columns were filled with the names of dozens of future brides and grooms, with event dates extending well into the next 12 months. Next to each name was a hefty dollar amount representing their massive venue deposits. But the final column was what made the air catch in my throat. It was labeled with a simple, devastating phrase. The phrase read, "Temporarily reallocated." Every single dollar from those future weddings had been completely drained. The funds were not sitting safely in an escrow account as promised. They had been moved to cover immediate, bleeding liabilities. The elegant, untouchable Voss family was not just experiencing a temporary cash flow problem. They were running a massive, desperate financial shell game, and I was supposed to be their final, unknowing investor. I closed the folder, slid it smoothly into my car as the valet pulled up, and drove away into the dark night, preparing for absolute war. I locked the heavy oak door of my hotel suite and let the silence of the room wash over me. I did not collapse against the wood. I did not bury my face in my hands. And I certainly did not shed a single tear over my fractured fairy tale. There was no room for panic. Panic was a useless emotion reserved for people who did not know how to dismantle a threat. I kicked off my shoes, walked directly to my leather briefcase, and pulled out my laptop. I connected my phone via a secure network and mirrored my screen to the massive television mounted on the wall opposite the bed. The dimly lit photographs I had discreetly taken under the mahogany table suddenly blew up to 50 inches of glowing, undeniable truth. Mason Voss genuinely believed I was a mid-level logistics coordinator. It was a comfortable, unthreatening narrative he had constructed for himself early in our relationship, and I had simply never felt the need to correct his patronizing assumptions. Let him believe I spent my days ordering catering platters and arranging conference room chairs. In reality, I was the sole founder and managing partner of Stone Harbor Recovery Group. We were an elite boutique consulting firm specializing in loss recovery, forensic financial auditing, and corporate contract disputes. My entire career was built on hunting down hidden liabilities, exposing fraudulent agreements, and protecting assets from corporate predators. I read predatory contracts for breakfast. Mason thought he was graciously elevating a naive, working-class woman into his sophisticated world of old money. He had absolutely no idea he had just invited a seasoned shark into his rapidly draining fish tank. I stood in front of the television, my arms crossed, and enhanced the contrast on the first photograph. The dense legal text hiding beneath the decoy vendor form came into sharp, brutal relief. It was a spousal guarantee, permanently and legally shackled to a confession of judgment. For those unfamiliar with high-stakes corporate debt, a confession of judgment is the most draconian financial instrument legally permissible in this state. It essentially means that by signing, you preemptively surrender your right to defend yourself in court. If the debtor defaults, the lender can immediately seize your assets without a trial, without a hearing, and without warning. I scanned down to the principal amount of the bridge loan. The number stared back at me in stark black ink. $6,800,000. The lender was Crescent Ridge Capital, a notorious firm that circled distressed companies like vultures waiting for the final breath. They had secured this massive debt against the Bell Meridian Hospitality Group, but clearly, the Voss family's heavily leveraged corporate assets were not enough to satisfy the underwriters. The bank needed fresh, unencumbered blood to absorb the catastrophic risk. They needed a new guarantor. I clicked to the next image, zooming in on the attached asset schedule. A freezing wave rolled through my chest, though my pulse remained a steady 60 beats per minute. The schedule listed the collateral meant to back the loan. It was not Voss property. It was mine. Every single line item was a piece of the life I had built from nothing. My personal investment portfolios were listed down to the exact account numbers. The secluded lake house I had purchased outright 3 years ago was documented. Worst of all, my controlling equity stake in Stone Harbor Recovery Group was meticulously detailed as the primary source of collateral. They had run a shadow financial investigation on me behind my back. They knew exactly what my net worth was, and they intended to feed every last penny of it to their creditors. I analyzed the signature block at the bottom of the page. Mason had already signed the document. His signature was slashed aggressively across the paper in dark ink. The date next to his name had been backdated by 2 weeks to make it appear as though the loan had been finalized well before the wedding chaos. Below his signature was a blank line designated for the guarantor. My name was printed neatly underneath it. The spacing was incredibly deliberate, a masterpiece of operational deception. The line was positioned at the exact millimeter on the page where the signature line of the decoy florist confirmation form would rest. If I had simply lifted the edge of the top page and signed exactly where Evelyn had pointed her perfectly manicured finger, the pressure of my pen would have legally bound me to a sinking ship. I glanced at the digital clock on the bedside table. It was 2 in the morning. I picked up my phone and dialed the emergency secure line for Alder and Wren Risk Counsel, my retained legal team. I did not care what time it was. I paid them an exorbitant monthly retainer for exactly this type of midnight crisis. The lead partner answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly and thick with sleep. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him to wake up his entire forensic team immediately and get them to their computers. I transmitted the encrypted photographs to his secure server. I instructed him to initiate a full metadata sweep on the document structure. Verify the alphanumeric notary identification code stamped at the bottom of the pages, and pull every public financial filing associated with the Voss family and Bell Meridian within the last 36 months. I kept the line open, pacing the length of the suite in the dark. 45 minutes later, the partner came back on the line. His tone was completely sober, stripped of any lingering exhaustion. He confirmed my exact hypothesis. He told me the notary code belonged to an in-house administrative employee of the Voss corporate office, a clear conflict of interest but legally binding enough to cause a nightmare. The document was an active, registered debt vehicle waiting for final execution. He confirmed that if I signed that paper, the moment Bell Meridian defaulted, Crescent Ridge Capital would instantly trigger the confession of judgment. The marriage certificate I was supposed to sign tomorrow morning was just the secondary mechanism to solidify the spousal liability, tying me to Mason so tightly that no divorce lawyer could untangle the debt before my assets were seized. My lawyer's advice was immediate and unequivocal. He strongly advised me to pack my bags, leave the hotel right now, and let his office send a formal cancellation notice by courier at dawn. He called it the safest tactical retreat. He said getting entangled with a family this desperate was a losing game. I stood by the window, pulling back the heavy blackout curtains. I looked out over the dark expanse of the ocean, watching the waves crash violently against the shore. The sheer audacity of their plan burned cold in my veins. If I fled tonight, the wedding would simply be canceled due to a bride with sudden cold feet. The Voss family would retain total control of the narrative. They would play the tragic victims abandoned at the altar. They would quietly shred the fraudulent loan documents, bury the evidence of their massive insolvency, and continue smiling for the society cameras. More importantly, they would simply delay their inevitable collapse and begin hunting for another wealthy, unsuspecting target to drain. If I walked away, they would survive. They would win. I told my lawyer I was not going anywhere. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a heavy silence. I instructed him to gather the team and prepare a highly specific, aggressive counteroffensive by dawn. I laid out a series of legal maneuvers that would lock my assets behind impenetrable corporate firewalls before the sun even came up. I told him this was no longer a matter of simply dodging a bad marriage. This was an active asset defense operation. I hung up the phone and turned around to face the room. In the corner, hanging from a velvet-padded hanger, was my wedding dress. It was pristine, white, and breathtakingly elegant. I stared at it for a long time. Tomorrow morning. I was going to put it on. I was going to have my hair styled and my makeup perfectly applied. I was going to walk down that grand aisle, holding a bouquet of white flowers, and I was going to smile at every single guest in that ballroom. I was going to let Evelyn and Mason Voss believe their trap had worked perfectly, right up until the exact second I burned their entire legacy to the ground. The glow of my laptop screen was the only light in the suite. I opened a direct, encrypted channel with the forensics team at Alder and Wren. We began a surgical dissection of Bell Meridian Hospitality Group. If the loan document was the smoking gun, their corporate filings were the mass grave. We did not just look at the surface. We dug deep into merchant accounts, municipal event permits, state tax registries, and civil dockets. We hunted for the suppressed complaints and the buried violations that never made it into the glossy bridal magazines. What we found was a spectacularly painted corpse. The empire was not just struggling. It was clinically dead, propped up entirely by fraud and sheer audacity. The first major anomaly flashed across my screen around 3:30 in the morning. My lead investigator pulled a municipal compliance report from the county fire marshal. 3 weeks ago, Marigold House had failed a comprehensive fire safety and emergency exit inspection. The violations were not minor administrative hiccups. The automated fire suppression system in the massive catering kitchen was completely faulty, rendered useless by years of neglected maintenance. Furthermore, the venue had repeatedly violated maximum occupancy limits to squeeze in larger, more profitable guest lists, compromising the structural safety of the emergency egress routes. Because of these severe infractions, the county had placed their primary event operating permit under immediate suspension, pending a costly mandatory remediation. They were not legally allowed to host a gathering of more than 50 people. Yet, in less than 12 hours, they were planning to pack 200 of the region's wealthiest individuals into that very ballroom. The disgust hit me in a sharp, cold wave. I started cross-referencing the failed inspection dates with the blue operational folder I had acquired from the frantic assistant earlier that evening. Evelyn had known about the suspended permit for 21 days. During that exact 3-week window, she had aggressively pushed promotional booking packages. She had accepted massive, non-refundable deposits from dozens of new brides for dates stretching across the next 6 months. She was actively selling them a dream she knew she had no legal authority to deliver. I directed my team to trace the flow of those specific deposit funds. According to the standard Bell Meridian contract, client money was legally required to be held in a secure, untouched escrow account until the week of the actual event. It was a selling point they boasted about to project stability and trustworthiness. It was an absolute lie. The forensic accounting software illuminated a frantic, desperate shell game. The deposits never sat in escrow. The moment a young couple wired their money, the funds were immediately siphoned into the corporate general ledger. From there, the money hemorrhaged outward in a dozen different directions. Evelyn was using the wedding funds of future brides to pay the exorbitant daily interest on their existing predatory loans. She was draining those accounts to settle past due invoices with premium liquor distributors who had threatened to cut off their supply right before the busy season. She was using the stolen cash to pay massive retention bonuses to her core operational staff, desperately trying to keep them from walking out and exposing the rot to the press. Mason had once casually mentioned over dinner that the family business was just dealing with a minor, short-term liquidity issue due to seasonal fluctuations. He had said it with such convincing, breezy arrogance, dismissing it as a standard hurdle of high-level entrepreneurship, but the spreadsheets in front of me told a story of total systemic insolvency. Bell Meridian was not just short on cash, they were drowning in debt at every conceivable level. They owed hundreds of thousands in back taxes to the state revenue service. They were completely delinquent on payments to their exclusive floral vendors, leaving small business owners entirely unpaid for months of grueling labor. The high-end audiovisual companies that provided their cinematic lighting and sound engineering were actively preparing breach of contract lawsuits. And then, my legal team uncovered the most terrifying detail of all. Bell Meridian had stopped paying their commercial event liability insurance premiums 4 months ago. The policy had completely lapsed. I sat back in my chair, staring at the cascading data streams illuminating my hotel room walls. The sheer magnitude of their recklessness was breathtaking. If a single catering heater caught fire in that non-compliant kitchen tomorrow, or if a guest tripped over an unsecured cable in the dimly lit ballroom, there would be no insurance payout. There was no financial safety net. The ensuing chain reaction of personal injury and gross negligence lawsuits would obliterate the entire Voss family venue system in a matter of weeks. The empire would not just fold quietly into bankruptcy, it would explode, taking down every employee, every independent vendor, and every innocent couple who had trusted them with their life savings. This was the horrific reality behind the rushed, manipulative dinner. This was why Evelyn and Mason were so utterly desperate to secure my signature on a confession of judgment before the sun came up. They did not look at me and see a partner. They did not see a woman they wanted to welcome into their family. They saw a human shield. They knew the collapse was imminent, perhaps only days away. They needed my unencumbered assets, my clean credit history, and my profitable consulting firm to serve as the final life raft when their ship inevitably went down. They intended to legally bind me to the impending explosion, ensuring that when the creditors and the state authorities came looking for blood, mine would be the first spilled. A profound shift occurred in my mind during that dark hour. When I first saw the fraudulent loan document, my reaction was pure self-preservation. I wanted to protect my wealth, sever my ties with a toxic family, and walk away clean. But as I looked at the names of the dozens of young women in that blue folder, women who had poured their savings into Evelyn's bank accounts, the nature of my anger changed entirely. This was no longer just a personal defense strategy. The Voss family was running a predatory machine wrapped in white silk and imported roses. They were going to keep smiling, keep hosting glamorous venue tours, and keep destroying people's financial futures to fund their own delusions of grandeur. If I simply walked away, I would be leaving those future victims to face the exact same slaughterhouse. The Voss family would just find another target to drain. I typed a new, decisive directive to my legal team. The mission parameters were no longer just about nullifying the spousal guarantee. We were going to assemble a kill shot. We were going to gather every piece of this fraudulent puzzle, organize it into undeniable, legally actionable evidence, and prepare to detonate it right in the middle of their perfect stage. I was going to ensure that by the time the wedding march finished playing, the Bell Meridian Hospitality Group would never be able to defraud another trusting client again. They wanted a flawless, unforgettable event. I decided I was going to give them exactly that. While my legal team continued to excavate the ruins of the corporate filings, a secondary alert chimed on my secure dashboard. The forensic accounting software had flagged a massive, anomalous cash injection. In the midst of all the bounced checks, suspended permits, and ignored invoices, a single, massive wire transfer had cleared the main operational account just 48 hours ago. It was an infusion of exactly $185,000. This was the precise amount of money Evelyn had used to temporarily silence the most aggressive premium liquor distributor and pay the desperately overdue catering staff retainers. It was the only reason the wedding venue had not been completely abandoned by its workforce before I even arrived for the rehearsal dinner. I traced the routing number backwards. I expected to find another predatory lender, or perhaps a blindly trusting society friend who had been swindled into a short-term bridge loan. Instead, the digital trail led away from the glittering world of high finance and straight into a modest, fiercely protected commercial banking account. The account belonged to Wyatt Cole. Wyatt was married to Mason's younger sister, Celeste. In a family composed almost entirely of preening peacocks and professional socialites, Wyatt was the sole, exhausted workhorse. He was a brilliant structural engineer. He was the kind of man who had dirt under his fingernails, calluses on his palms, and permanent dark circles under his eyes. For the past 7 years, he had bled for a massive corporate engineering firm, saving every spare dollar and working 80-hour weeks so he could finally launch his own independent practice. He called it Harbor Span Engineering. It was his absolute dream, built on a foundation of genuine, grueling labor. More importantly, Wyatt was the only person in the entire Voss family orbit who had ever treated me like a human being. When I first attended the suffocating Sunday dinners at the estate, Evelyn and Mason would subtly mock my lack of pedigree. Celeste would look at my clothes with thinly veiled pity, acting as though my presence lowered the property value of the room. But Wyatt would pull up a chair next to me and ask me genuine questions about my auditing firm. He respected the grind because he lived it. He offered real, unpretentious kindness in a house built entirely on polished cruelty. I stared at the screen, my blood running completely cold. I knew Wyatt. He was incredibly conservative with his capital. He would never willingly dump his hard-earned startup funds into Evelyn's failing party planning business. I directed my lead investigator to pull the transactional metadata and the authorization logs for that specific wire transfer. The truth that emerged over the next 30 minutes was arguably the most repulsive discovery of the entire night. Wyatt had not authorized the transfer. He had absolutely no idea his money was gone. The digital signature attached to the banking authorization was a clumsy, expedited forgery. The IP address that initiated the transfer did not originate from Wyatt's small downtown office. It originated from a device matching the exact serial number of Celeste's personal laptop, operating on the private wireless network of Marigold House. She had bypassed the dual authentication security protocols by routing the request through their joint domestic checking account first, making it look like an internal household transfer, before instantly dumping the entire sum into the Bell Meridian black hole. Celeste had completely drained his business contingency fund. She had wiped out the restricted capital he had meticulously saved to purchase highly specialized surveying equipment for his new firm. He had literally traded his sleep, his health, and his youth for that money, and his own wife had stolen it with a few callous keystrokes to buy her mother a few more days of fake prestige. The forensic team dug deeper and unearthed the communication logs between the husband and wife. I read the intercepted text messages. 2 days ago, Wyatt had noticed the initial internal transfer and asked his wife why the account balance had suddenly dropped. Celeste had lied to him with terrifying sociopathic ease. She sent back a series of sweet, reassuring messages. She told him she had proactively spoken to their accountant and moved the capital into a temporary holding account to maximize their tax-sheltering strategies before the new fiscal year began. She played the role of the incredibly helpful, financially savvy partner. She told him not to worry his brilliant head about the boring administrative details. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the headboard of the hotel bed. I thought back to the dozens of times I had sat across from Evelyn Voss and listened to her tear Wyatt apart. Evelyn was relentless in her subtle, smiling mockery of her son-in-law. She would constantly comment on his practical vehicles, his refusal to buy absurdly expensive watches, and his preference for a quiet weekend over a flashy charity gala. She claimed he lacked the innate, upper-class aura of a true Voss. She despised him for respecting the value of a single dollar, treating his financial caution as a vulgar character flaw. Yet, behind closed doors, she had absolutely no qualms about letting her daughter steal his life savings to keep the champagne flowing at her parties. Staring at the glowing data streams, the final, horrifying piece of the Voss family psychology clicked into place. They were not merely incompetent business owners clinging to a sinking ship. They were institutional parasites. Their entire existence relied on identifying capable, loving outsiders, bringing them into the fold, and draining them completely dry. If you loved them, they weaponized that love against you. They used marriage vows as financial binding spells. They used the illusion of family loyalty, the crushing weight of their manufactured guilt, and the relentless, suffocating pressure to maintain their flawless social image to extract every single ounce of value from the people who trusted them. Mason was attempting to do it to me with a fraudulent loan guarantee. Celeste had already executed it perfectly against Wyatt through sheer, unadulterated theft. They viewed us not as spouses, but as unmined resources. A deep protective anger washed over me, eclipsing the cold fury I felt for my own situation. I could defend myself. I had a team of ruthless corporate lawyers and a lifetime of experience dismantling predators. But Wyatt was defenseless. He was an innocent casualty in a war he did not even know he was fighting. He was standing on the deck of a sinking ship, completely unaware that his wife had already sold his life vest. He did not deserve to go down with their empire. I sat forward and opened a new, highly encrypted folder on my desktop. I began compiling a specific, undeniable, and devastating evidence dossier designed exclusively for him. I isolated the forged digital signatures. I pulled the exact timestamps of the wire transfers and matched them flawlessly against Celeste's location data. I included the bank routing codes that proved unequivocally that the money never went to a secure tax shelter, but flowed directly into Evelyn's overdrawn operational accounts to pay for catering and liquor. I connected my laptop to the portable wireless printer I always carried in my luggage for remote field audits. The machine whirred quietly in the dark room, spitting out page after page of undeniable truth. I gathered the warm sheets of paper and organized them logically, ensuring the narrative of his wife's betrayal was impossible to misinterpret. I sealed the thick stack of documents inside a heavy, unmarked manila envelope. I took a thick black marker and wrote a very short, very specific set of instructions across the front of the envelope. I wrote that he must absolutely not open the package until the wedding ceremony officially begins. Beneath that, I added one final, crucial directive. I told him to keep his phone off silent. I needed him to be fully armed and entirely ready the moment I detonated the explosive truth in front of their entire world. The digital clock on the nightstand clicked to 4 o'clock in the morning. I had not slept a single minute, yet my mind was sharper than a surgical blade. The time for gathering intelligence was over. It was time to construct the battlefield. I did not pace. I did not tremble. I sat perfectly still at the desk and began deploying a series of tactical strikes that would box the Voss family in from every conceivable angle. First, I had to ensure my personal fortress was entirely impenetrable. Years ago, anticipating the unpredictable nature of high-stakes corporate warfare, I had established a dormant holding structure called Slate Reef Holdings. It was a perfectly legal, airtight corporate entity designed to act as an emergency vault. I opened a secure video conference with the executive board of my consulting firm. I pulled my key partners out of bed in the dead of night. Within 45 minutes, we held an emergency session over encrypted channels. I directed the board to execute an immediate, sweeping transfer of assets. By 5 in the morning, the vast majority of my personal liquid capital, my real estate deeds, and the controlling shares of my own company were securely relocated under the protective umbrella of Slate Reef Holdings. Furthermore, the board officially ratified a strict anti-transfer clause and a severe limitation of recourse on all my remaining visible assets. This maneuver fundamentally altered the reality of the impending war. The meticulous asset schedule that Evelyn and Mason had attached to their predatory loan was now completely obsolete. The wealth they thought they were stealing simply did not belong to Daphne Stone anymore. It belonged to an untouchable trust. This meant that even if they managed to physically force my hand to sign that paper at the altar, the document would instantly transform into a legal landmine. By presenting a contract with falsely listed collateral and a concealed purpose, the Voss family would be committing textbook financial fraud. The trap they set for me was now wired to blow up in their own hands. While I moved the money, my legal team at Alder and Wren executed their own defensive strike. They officially sealed the metadata of the photographs I had taken under the dining room table. They generated a cryptographic hash of the document's digital footprint. This created undeniable, time-stamped proof of the exact moment the file was created, the extensive history of its modifications, and the glaring, irrefutable fact that the spousal guarantee page had been maliciously inserted into the stack of wedding forms long after the original vendor contracts were drafted. We now had absolute, court-ready proof of premeditated deception, but a strong defense was not enough to satisfy the cold anger settling deep in my chest. I needed to engineer their complete, public destruction. I opened a heavily encrypted email client and drafted a direct message to the senior underwriting partners at Crescent Ridge Capital. Predatory lenders were ruthless, but they absolutely despised being played for fools by their own desperate clients. I did not ask them to save me. I simply provided them with the digital forensics Alder and Wren had compiled. I attached the proof of the backdated signatures, the tampered asset schedules, and a brief, clinical summary explaining that the Voss family was attempting to use an unknowing bride as an instrument of loan fraud. I made it explicitly clear that the collateral they were relying on was legally inaccessible as of this morning. I knew exactly how Crescent Ridge would react. They would not wait for the Voss family to officially default. They would trigger an immediate breach of contract and move to seize whatever was left of Bell Meridian before lunch. Next, I turned my attention to the physical trap of Marigold House. The venue was an active hazard operating on a suspended permit. I compiled the county fire marshal reports, the internal emails detailing the broken suppression systems, and the evidence of their intentional overcrowding. I sent the entire package directly to the emergency dispatch line of the Bracken County Fire and Life Safety Office. I flagged the communication with a high priority status. notifying them that a major event exceeding 200 people was scheduled to take place in a structurally compromised building in a matter of hours. I knew the municipal authorities could not ignore a documented threat of that scale. I was guaranteeing that men in uniform would walk through those mahogany doors at the exact moment I needed them most. There was only one piece of the puzzle left: the audience. I opened the blue operational folder I had acquired from the frantic assistant. I scanned the list of future brides whose deposits had been stolen to float Evelyn's sinking ship. I selected 3 names. These were women who had paid their final, massive installments just days ago, money that was already gone. I used an anonymous internet number to send them each a highly personalized, urgent text message. I introduced myself as a confidential auditor reviewing the financial discrepancies at Bell Meridian. I told them their event deposits had been compromised. I did not ask them to believe me blindly. Instead, I formally invited them to attend my wedding ceremony that afternoon as my personal, unlisted guests. I provided them with a specific entry code for the side gate and instructed them to sit quietly in the very back row of the ballroom. I told them that if they wanted to see exactly where their money had been buried, they needed to be there when the music stopped. I knew human nature. I knew the sheer panic of losing tens of thousands of dollars would drive them to show up, demanding answers. By 6 o'clock in the morning, the sun began to rise, casting a pale, gray light over the ocean outside my window. My phone was silent. The emails were sent. The legal firewalls were locked. The board was adjourned. The entire counteroffensive had been perfectly assembled in total silence while my enemies slept. I closed my laptop and stood up. I walked over to the corner of the room where my wedding gown hung suspended in the soft morning light. It was a masterpiece of heavy silk and delicate lace, shimmering faintly in the dawn. A normal woman discovering this level of betrayal would have fled. She would have called her family, cried hysterically into the phone, and vanished before the caterers even arrived. But I was not going to run. Running meant conceding the stage to the people who tried to destroy me. It meant letting them control the narrative, letting them play the tragic victims of a runaway bride, and letting them quietly hide the bodies of their financial victims to hunt again. I reached out and ran my fingers along the smooth fabric of the dress. I made my final, symbolic decision. I was going to put on this gown. I was going to sit perfectly still while the makeup artist painted my face and the stylists pinned up my hair. I was going to walk into Marigold House looking absolutely flawless. I was going to smile at Evelyn, take Mason's hand at the altar, and let them believe, right up until the very last possible second, that they had successfully secured their ultimate prize. I was going to give them the grandest, most unforgettable wedding they had ever hosted. The grandfather clock in the hallway had just chimed 9 times when the double doors to my bridal suite swung violently open. There was no polite knock. There was no soft inquiry to see if the bride was decent. Evelyn and her daughter Celeste marched across the threshold, bringing the frigid air of a corporate boardroom into a room meant for champagne and hairspray. Evelyn was dressed in a severely tailored mother-of-the-groom gown that looked more like armor than silk. Tucked tightly beneath her left arm was the exact same cream-colored leather portfolio from the dinner table. In her right hand, she gripped a heavy, polished silver pen. She held it out slightly, presenting it as if it were a royal scepter rather than the instrument of my financial execution. Celeste trailed half a step behind her mother. She clutched a mimosa glass and looked around the suite with a permanent, subtle sneer etched into her features. Her eyes swept over me as I sat in the makeup chair. I was draped in a simple white robe, my hair halfway pinned up. Celeste let out a short, breathy laugh that carried absolutely no warmth. She looked at me not as a future sister-in-law, but as a heavily discounted piece of antique furniture they were preparing to drag out into the public square. She looked as though she was mentally calculating how much lacquer I would need before I was presentable enough to stand next to her brother. Evelyn walked directly to the vanity, bypassing the stylists entirely. She placed the leather portfolio on the marble counter with a heavy thud. She unclasped it and laid the silver pen carefully on top of the documents. She looked at my wedding gown hanging in the corner. Her lips pressed together into a thin, critical line. She let out a long sigh and adjusted the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She told me the dress was quite lovely in its own quaint way. She paused, letting the silence stretch, before adding that it was perhaps a bit too simple for the standard their family usually projected to their high society guests. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her own skirt and suggested that perhaps my minimalist taste was just a symptom of my modest upbringing. I did not flinch. I did not offer a defensive justification. I looked at her through the reflection in the vanity mirror and smiled warmly. The trap required me to be soft, compliant, and deeply immersed in the romantic delusion they had constructed for me. Evelyn tapped the silver pen against the marble. She told me they needed to finalize the vendor confirmation forms right this instant. She claimed the venue coordinator was having a minor panic attack in the ballroom and simply could not proceed with seating the guests until the paperwork was officially archived. Her voice was firm, stripped of the fake warmth she had used the night before. She was commanding me, not asking. I turned around in the chair, letting my expression soften into a mask of pure, starry-eyed devotion. I reached out and gently pushed the leather folder an inch away from me. I told her I had been thinking about her advice all night. I said I finally understood the profound weight of the family legacy she was trying to protect. I kept my voice light, breathless, and dripping with naive enthusiasm. I explained that I did not want to treat this paperwork like a chore to be hidden away in a dressing room. I told Evelyn I wanted to elevate the moment. I suggested we place the documents on the ceremonial signing table directly at the altar. I wanted to sign the papers in front of all 200 guests, right after the vows were exchanged. I looked deeply into Evelyn's eyes and quoted her own corporate marketing material back to her. I said doing it publicly would perfectly embody the core spirit of the Belle Meridian brand, which always promoted absolute transparency and breathtaking beauty. The psychological strike landed flawlessly. Evelyn's jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might crack. Celeste stopped swirling her mimosa. Her smug expressions suddenly freezing. I had cornered them with their own vanity. They had spent decades building a public image based on those exact buzzwords. If they refused my incredibly romantic, brand-aligned suggestion, they would have to provide a logical reason why the paperwork needed to be signed in the shadows. They could not argue against transparency without looking suspicious. Evelyn stared at me, searching my face for any hint of mockery or awareness. I gave her nothing but the glowing, dim-witted smile of a woman blindly in love with her son. Defeated by her own public relations strategy, Evelyn offered a stiff, jerky nod. She snapped the portfolio shut, grabbed the silver pen, and spun on her heel. She muttered that she would have the coordinator prepare the altar table immediately. She stormed out of the suite, Celeste rushing closely behind her. As soon as the doors clicked shut, my phone vibrated against the vanity. It was the 12th message I had received from Mason since sunrise. My darling groom was putting on a desperate performance. His messages were overflowing with fake affection, asking how my morning was going, telling me how much I meant to him, and reminding me to breathe. But buried beneath the sweet words was a frantic, vibrating panic. He kept asking if his mother had stopped by yet. He wanted to know if we had cleared up the boring logistical details. He was sweating through his tailored tuxedo, terrified that the spousal guarantee remained unsigned while the clock ticked closer to the ceremony. I picked up the phone and typed a response carefully designed to soothe his bleeding nerves. I told him I was just overwhelmed with happy butterflies. I promised him everything was perfect and that I could not wait to meet him at the altar to make our union official. I hit send and watched the delivery confirmation appear. I was feeding him the exact sedative he needed to stay docile until the trap sprang shut. 15 minutes later, the door to the suite opened again. This time, it was Wyatt. He stepped into the room with a hesitant, respectful posture. He looked utterly exhausted. His shoulders slumped beneath the weight of his dark suit. In his hands, he carried a small, beautifully wrapped box. It was a vintage silver picture frame, a genuinely thoughtful, unpretentious gift meant to welcome me to the family. Celeste had walked back into the room right behind him, instantly loudly complaining to the head makeup artist about the lighting in the hallway. She was entirely focused on her own reflection in the full-length mirror, posing and adjusting the slit of her dress. Wyatt approached my chair and offered a tired but sincere smile. He told me I looked beautiful. He said Mason was a lucky man. I stood up, stepping close to him to accept the gift. I positioned my body to completely block Celeste's line of sight. As I reached for the small box with my right hand, my left hand retrieved the thick manila envelope I had prepared before dawn. I pressed the heavy package directly into his calloused palm. Wyatt frowned, looking down at the unmarked envelope. He opened his mouth to ask a question, but I instantly squeezed his wrist, silencing him. I leaned in close, keeping my voice pitched to an absolute whisper. I told him to put the envelope in his jacket pocket right now. I instructed him to not open it, not read a single word, and not react until the wedding music started playing in the ballroom. I gave him one final, crucial order. I told him to make sure his phone was not on silent. He stared into my eyes, registering the deadly seriousness of my tone. The exhaustion in his face shifted into a sharp, quiet alertness. He did not ask for an explanation. He smoothly slid the envelope into the breast pocket of his suit jacket, just as Celeste turned away from the mirror and snapped at him to hurry up. Wyatt gave me one last, lingering look before following his wife out the door. The room finally emptied, leaving only the quiet hum of the air conditioning. I walked over to the window and looked down at the courtyard. Delivery trucks were pulling away, and caterers were rushing between the tents. Everything looked like a standard, chaotic luxury event, but beneath the surface, the infrastructure of the wedding had been entirely hijacked. The previous night, I had systematically dismantled the Voss family control over the event production. The elite audiovisual team that usually managed the lighting, microphones, and massive digital screens for Bell Meridian had been mysteriously canceled due to a fabricated scheduling conflict. In their place was an entirely different crew. I had wired $15,000 from my untraceable corporate account to a fiercely independent, highly professional production company from 3 counties over. They were currently setting up their control boards at the back of the Marigold House ballroom. They did not answer to the venue manager, they did not answer to Mason, and they certainly did not answer to Evelyn. They were operating on a very strict, highly lucrative contract that bound them exclusively to me. They had my digital files loaded onto their secure servers, and they were waiting for a single, specific visual cue from the bride. I turned away from the window and walked back to the mirror. I picked up a tube of sheer lip gloss and carefully applied a final coat. The glossy shine caught the light, perfecting the illusion of a soft, compliant woman ready to be consumed by a powerful family. The strings of the trap were pulled incredibly tight, stretched to their absolute physical limit. All I had to do now was walk down the aisle and cut them. The grand ballroom of Marigold House was a masterclass in aggressive, unapologetic luxury. It was a space designed exclusively to overwhelm the senses and demand absolute submission from anyone who dared to walk through its heavy wooden doors. Thousands of pristine white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceiling in elaborate, gravity-defying floral installations. Their sweet, heavy scent hung thick in the air, a desperate, expensive perfume meant to entirely mask the stench of the financial rot actively eating away at the floorboards beneath our feet. Floor-to-ceiling glass panes made up the entire western wall of the room, offering a breathtaking, completely unobstructed view of the sunlit coastal lagoon. At the very front of the room, standing high behind a raised acrylic altar, was a massive digital screen. It was currently dormant, projecting a softly glowing, elegant monogram of our intertwined initials, patiently waiting to display the heavily edited, fiercely curated video montage of our supposed love story. Every single chair in the vast room was filled. The Voss family had packed the venue with their most valuable social currency. I stood in the hidden, dimly lit vestibule just outside the main doors, listening to the low, humming vibration of their collective whispers. They were a sea of designer silk, bespoke tailoring, and generational arrogance. I could hear the sharp, clipped tones of wealthy women assessing my worth. They were murmuring about my lack of a prominent family name, trading polite but venomous theories about how exactly I had managed to secure the golden heir of Bracken Point. In their eyes, I was nothing more than a lottery winner. I was a remarkably lucky, utterly ordinary woman who was about to be dragged upward, elevated far beyond her natural station. They were completely certain that I should be trembling with profound gratitude just to be allowed in the building. But their arrogant assessments were entirely focused on the front of the room, on the glittering stage the Voss family had built. Not a single member of that elite, self-absorbed crowd bothered to look toward the shadows at the very back of the ballroom. If they had simply turned their heads, they would have noticed a glaring anomaly. Sitting incredibly discreetly in the last row, blending into the dim lighting near the heavy exit doors, were my carefully selected guests. There was the senior legal representative from Crescent Ridge Capital. He was wearing a sharp, dark suit that screamed corporate litigation and ruthless efficiency. He sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap, his cold eyes fixed on the altar with the calculation of a predator waiting for a wounded animal to finally collapse. 2 rows ahead of him sat the municipal officials from the County Fire and Life Safety Office. They wore standard-issue jackets, looking entirely out of place among the couture dresses and tuxedos. Their expressions were tight, their jaws clenched with the professional knowledge that the beautiful building they were sitting inside was an active, illegal, and highly dangerous hazard. And clustered tightly together in the far right corner were the 3 brides. They were young women who had handed over their life savings to Evelyn Voss just weeks ago, entirely trusting the Belle Meridian brand. They sat perfectly still, their faces pale and drawn, clutching their purses tightly in their laps. They were not there to celebrate a union of 2 souls. They were there to witness an execution, waiting for the exact moment the music stopped so they could demand the money that had been stolen from them. The string quartet positioned near the glass wall began to play a slow, sweeping classical piece. Through the slight crack in the vestibule doors, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the stage. Mason stood confidently at the altar. He looked exactly like an actor playing the role of a handsome prince. His tuxedo was impeccably tailored to his broad shoulders, his dark hair perfectly swept back. He projected an aura of total, unshakable confidence. He shifted his weight slightly from foot to foot, a microscopic movement that betrayed his internal impatience. He was not a man eager to pledge his life to the woman he loved. He was a man counting down the agonizing seconds until his corporate bailout was legally secured. He genuinely believed that in less than 10 minutes, his family would walk away completely unscathed, their massive debts erased by my signature. In the absolute center of the front row sat Evelyn. She was completely rigid, her spine perfectly straight, her sharp eyes fixed relentlessly on the small, ornate wooden table positioned just to the left of the altar. It was the signing table I had requested that morning. Placed precisely in the center of that polished wood was the thick cream-colored leather portfolio. Evelyn's right hand rested in her lap, but her fingers were curled incredibly tightly around the heavy silver pen she had brandished in my dressing room. She was gripping the metal so hard her knuckles were entirely white. It was her final weapon, and she was desperately waiting for the moment to strike. My eyes drifted past the mother of the groom and found Wyatt. He was seated at the far end of the second row, physically distanced from the toxic core of the family. He was not looking at the altar. He was staring down at his cellular phone, keeping the screen partially concealed behind the thick, glossy pages of the wedding program. I knew exactly what he was looking at. The manila envelope I had pressed into his hand earlier contained a secure digital access card, linking his device directly to the encrypted evidence dossier my team had built specifically for him. I watched his face carefully as he scrolled through the digital evidence. The psychological transformation was devastating to witness from afar. The initial look of mild, polite confusion slowly morphed into a deep, hollow shock. As he swiped past the forged wire transfer authorizations and the bank routing numbers proving his own wife had stolen his business capital, the color entirely drained from his face, his jaw locked with a sickening finality. His shoulders, usually slumped with the weight of constant exhaustion, went completely rigid. He slowly lifted his heavy head and looked directly at the back of Celeste's head in the row right in front of him. The look in his eyes was pure, freezing ice. He did not say a single word. He did not stand up and cause a scene. He simply slipped the phone back into his dark jacket pocket and sat there in the shadows, a fully loaded weapon waiting for the battle to officially begin. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom finally swung wide open. The string quartet swelled, hitting the dramatic, soaring crescendo of the processional march. The entire room stood up in unison. 200 faces turned away from the altar and looked toward the entrance. I stepped over the threshold and began my walk down the long, pristine white carpet. I walked entirely alone. There was no father walking beside me to give me away. No wealthy patriarch to symbolically transfer my ownership to the Voss family empire. I preferred it exactly this way. I was walking into this arena under my own absolute power. The air in the room felt incredibly thick, heavy with the suffocating weight of their collective expectations and silent judgments. I kept my face utterly blank. I did not smile at the guests. I did not weep delicate tears of joy. I moved with a slow, terrifyingly measured grace. I could feel their eyes analyzing every single stitch of my silk dress, evaluating every step I took. They mistook my profound, icy stillness for bridal nerves. They thought I was simply overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the wealthy world I was entering. They allowed themselves to misjudge me one final, fatal time. I kept my gaze locked directly on Mason at the end of the aisle. His chest expanded as he took a deep, theatrical breath, a smug, victorious light dancing in his dark eyes as I drew closer. He thought he was watching his salvation slowly approach. He thought I was nothing more than a naive, pliant woman walking blindly into a financial slaughterhouse. I knew the exact mechanics of a perfect trap. If you strike too early, the prey can still scramble away into the brush. You have to let them believe they have already won the game. You have to let their arrogance and their greed reach their absolute, blinding peak. You have to wait until their hands are physically reaching for the prize, until their guards are completely, foolishly down, before you bring the blade down to cut the string. I reached the end of the aisle and stepped up onto the raised acrylic platform. The sweet scent of the white orchids was overpowering, almost sickening. The heat from the massive lighting rig suspended above us warmed my bare skin. I stood next to Mason, feeling the immediate, suffocating pressure of his family closing in around me from the front row. The processional music slowly faded out, replaced by a hushed, heavily expectant silence. The storm was no longer gathering on the distant horizon. It was standing right here at the altar, breathing the same air they were, and none of them had the slightest idea how completely they were about to be destroyed. The officiant stepped up to the acrylic podium. His voice boomed through the hidden speakers, filling the massive room with rehearsed platitudes about eternal devotion and the sacred merging of two lives. I kept my eyes fixed forward, maintaining the serene, glassy expression of an overjoyed bride. Beside me, Mason shifted his weight. He reached out and enveloped my hands in his. His palms were clammy, generating a slick, uncomfortable heat against my cold skin. He leaned in, dipping his head so his mouth hovered just an inch from my ear. His breath was warm, smelling faintly of expensive mint and stale adrenaline. He squeezed my fingers, his grip tightening just past the point of comfort, crossing the line into a subtle physical warning. He whispered that we just had to sign a few quick pages in a moment. His tone was perfectly modulated to sound intimate to anyone watching, a loving secret shared between partners. But the underlying cadence was entirely possessive. It was the voice of a man securing an asset, not cherishing a wife. I nodded slowly, offering him a compliant, demure smile. The relief that washed over his face was immediate and palpable. The rigid tension in his shoulders instantly melted away. He actually let out a long, quiet exhale, believing he had successfully navigated the final hurdle. He stood a little taller, projecting the image of a conquering king to his assembled court. The officiant droned on, navigating the traditional vows. Mason recited his promises with the polished delivery of a seasoned actor hitting his marks on a stage. He promised to protect me. He promised to honor me. He promised to stand by me in times of absolute ruin. I repeated my own vows back to him, my voice steady, my delivery flawless. Every word I spoke was a perfectly crafted lie, echoing off the glass walls and floating over the heads of the 200 guests who were completely oblivious to the massacre about to unfold. As the final echoes of our vows faded into the heavy floral-scented air, the ceremony reached its administrative pivot. The officiant smiled warmly at the crowd and announced that the couple would now solidify their union by signing the official registry. This was the exact moment Evelyn had been agonizingly waiting for. I saw her move out of the corner of my eye. She did not stand up, but her posture snapped into a state of absolute predatory readiness. She gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to the venue coordinator hovering near the side aisle. Like a well-trained dog, the coordinator scurried forward. She carried the heavy, cream-colored leather portfolio pressed tightly against her chest. She stepped up onto the altar and placed it squarely in the center of the small, polished wooden table positioned to my left. She flipped the metal clasp open with a crisp click and folded the cover back. The thick stack of documents sat fully exposed under the blazing theatrical lights. The top page was the decoy, the harmless vendor confirmation form featuring the gold foil crest of the Bell Meridian Hospitality Group. But I knew exactly what venomous legal trap was lurking just one page beneath it. I did not object. I did not pull my hand away from Mason. I simply turned my body toward the table, moving with a calm, deliberate obedience. I let them present the trap in front of every single person in the room. Mason guided me toward the table, his hand resting firmly on the small of my back, subtly pushing me forward. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. In the front row, Evelyn leaned forward in her chair. Her carefully constructed mask of high society indifference slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a naked, desperate hunger. She watched my hand hover near the documents. She believed she had won. They both believed I was completely blind, entirely consumed by the pageantry of the wedding, ready to blindly surrender my entire net worth just to secure my place in their family. The officiant stood adjacent to the table, holding out a silver microphone on a sleek stand, ready to capture the sound of the pen scratching against the paper. Evelyn rose slightly from her seat, extending her arm to offer me the heavy silver pen she had been gripping for the last 20 minutes. I reached out, but I did not take the pen. Instead, I bypassed her hand entirely and wrapped my fingers around the stem of the microphone. I lifted it from the stand. A sudden, confused silence fell over the altar. Mason frowned, his hand dropping from my back. Evelyn froze, her arm still extended, the silver pen suspended in midair. This was not in the script. The bride was supposed to sign the paper, smile for the cameras, and walk away. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed loudly through the ballroom, crystal clear and entirely devoid of the nervous tremor they expected. I announced that before I signed anything binding me to this family, I needed to say a few brief words of profound gratitude. I looked down at Evelyn, pinning her with a warm, terrifyingly calm gaze. I told the room that I wanted to personally thank the Voss family for teaching me so much about the absolute importance of transparency in business. A soft, polite ripple of laughter rolled through the crowd of wealthy guests. They shifted in their seats, amused by the interruption. To them, it sounded like a charming, slightly clumsy speech from a working-class bride trying too hard to integrate corporate buzzwords into a romantic moment. They thought I was paying homage to the great Bell Meridian Empire. They had absolutely no idea I was digging its grave. While the crowd chuckled, a completely different reality was taking shape in the second row. I shifted my gaze slightly and locked onto Wyatt. He was no longer looking down at his phone. The screen had gone dark in his hand. He had read the final pages of the encrypted dossier. He had seen the forged signatures. He had seen the exact routing numbers proving his wife had systematically drained his entire business contingency fund. He had seen his life savings funneled directly into the bleeding accounts of the wedding venue we were currently standing inside. Wyatt slowly turned his head. He looked at Celeste, who was sitting directly in front of him. entirely focused on the altar, completely unaware that her husband had just discovered she was a thief. The expression on Wyatt's face was chilling. All the warmth, all the exhaustion, all the patient love he had carried for years was entirely gone. He looked at the woman he had married as if she were a total stranger, a dangerous predator he had just discovered sleeping in his bed. He did not yell, he did not move. He just stared at the back of her neck, with eyes that promised absolute destruction. I turned my attention back to the front row. The polite laughter from the crowd had faded. The silence in the room was now heavy, stretched tight like a wire about to snap. Mason was staring at me, his handsome face contorted into a mask of pure, frantic confusion. The smug victory had vanished from his eyes, replaced by a sudden, spiking terror. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and regain control of the narrative, to rush the signing before the illusion shattered. But I did not give him the chance. I held my cascading bouquet of white orchids in my left hand. I tightened my grip, my thumb pressing deep into the thick cluster of green stems. I felt the hard, plastic edge of the small remote control I had meticulously taped inside the arrangement earlier that morning. I pressed the single rubber button. A loud, electronic hum reverberated through the ballroom as the massive digital screen mounted directly behind the altar suddenly surged to life. The soft, glowing monogram vanished. I did not look back at the screen. I kept my eyes entirely focused on Evelyn. The blood had completely drained from her face. She was staring past me, looking up at the glowing display, her jaw slightly unhinged in a portrait of pure, unadulterated horror. I offered her a final, brilliant smile. I leaned into the microphone, making sure my voice reached every single corner of the silent, waiting room. I told her that if today was truly about celebrating family, then it was only fair that we let the entire family see exactly what they wanted me to sign. The massive digital display mounted behind the altar flickered brightly, casting a harsh, clinical glow over the pristine floral arrangements. It did not project a sepia-toned montage of our first dates or a carefully curated video of our supposed romance. Instead, the screen split cleanly down the middle, displaying two vastly different legal documents side by side. On the left side of the glowing board was the standard vendor confirmation sheet Evelyn had used as her decoy, complete with its elegant gold foil crest. On the right side was the hidden venom, the spousal guarantee and confession of judgment that had been buried beneath it. I held the microphone steady, my voice projecting crisp and clear over the sudden, confused murmurs of the 200 wealthy guests. I directed their attention to the right side of the screen. I explained precisely what they were looking at. I read the principal loan amount aloud, articulating every single syllable. $6,800,000. I pointed out the falsified asset schedule that listed my personal investments, my real estate, and my consulting firm as the collateral for a massive corporate debt I had never agreed to shoulder. I explained the digital metadata, the timestamp proving the Voss family had maliciously inserted the liability trap into a stack of operational paperwork just hours after the original contract was drafted. I told the room that my future husband and mother-in-law did not bring me here to marry me. They brought me here to legally force me to absorb the catastrophic financial collapse of the Bell Meridian Empire the moment we said our vows. A collective gasp rippled through the grand ballroom. The polite, hushed atmosphere shattered instantly. In the front row, Mason staggered back half a step, the blood draining completely from his face. His handsome, confident facade crumbled into an expression of pure, naked terror. Evelyn leaped to her feet, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish pulled from the water. I tightened my grip on the small remote hidden inside my bridal bouquet and pressed the button a second time. The dual documents vanished. In their place, a rapid succession of municipal and financial records illuminated the ballroom. The screen flashed the official red-stamped fire marshal citations detailing the broken suppression systems and the illegal overcrowding. It displayed the state revenue notices demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid corporate taxes. Finally, the display settled on the internal operational spreadsheet. It was a massive grid highlighting the names of dozens of future brides, paired with the exact dates of their upcoming weddings and the massive, non-refundable cash deposits they had paid. Next to those figures was the undeniable accounting trail showing that every single dollar had been illegally siphoned out of escrow to pay for the liquor and flowers currently sitting in this very room. At the very back of the ballroom, 3 women simultaneously stood up from their chairs. They were the future clients I had anonymously invited at dawn. One of them let out a piercing, furious shout, pointing directly at the screen where her name and her stolen $30,000 deposit were clearly listed. The other 2 began shouting for their money, their voices filled with raw panic and betrayal. Their screams were the spark that ignited the powder keg. The wealthy, aristocratic crowd erupted into absolute chaos. The guests realized all at once that they were sitting inside an uninsured, legally suspended fire trap, hosted by a family of desperate fraudsters. The elite socialites, who had been judging my lack of pedigree just 10 minutes ago, were now scrambling out of their chairs, knocking over crystal glasses and tearing the delicate silk table runners in their haste to distance themselves from the radioactive Voss name. Evelyn completely lost her mind. The regal, untouchable matriarch let out a feral shriek and lunged up the altar steps, her manicured hands clawing the air, desperately trying to rip the microphone from my grip. She never made it. The heavy double doors at the back of the room slammed open, hitting the walls with a thunderous crack. The 2 officials from the County Fire and Life Safety Office marched swiftly down the center aisle. They bypassed the fleeing guests and stepped directly into Evelyn's path. They loudly announced an immediate mandatory evacuation of the premises due to severe, unrectified safety violations. One of the officers slapped a massive, brightly colored emergency suspension order directly onto the polished wood of the main entrance, legally shutting down Marigold House indefinitely. As Evelyn was forced back by the uniformed officials, another figure stepped out of the shadows. The senior legal representative from Crescent Ridge Capital walked calmly up to the acrylic podium. He did not look at the crowd. He looked directly at Mason. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and pressed it hard into Mason's chest. The lawyer announced, in a voice loud enough to cut through the screaming crowd, that Bell Meridian Hospitality Group was now in immediate default. He stated that Crescent Ridge was executing a complete operational lockout, seizing all remaining physical assets effective this exact minute. Mason's knees buckled. He clutched the envelope, his eyes darting frantically toward me. He reached out a trembling hand, still clinging to the delusional hope that my signature could somehow reverse the avalanche. He stammered, begging me to just sign the papers, promising that my assets could buy them enough time to fix the misunderstanding. I looked down at him with absolute, freezing indifference. I leaned into the microphone one last time. I told him that as of 5 o'clock this morning, every single piece of liquid capital, property, and equity I owned had been legally transferred into an impenetrable corporate holding trust. I told him the wealthy bride he thought he was robbing was now a financial ghost. The prize they had torched their own reputation to steal was nothing but a mirage. Suddenly, a deep, booming voice cut through the localized panic near the front row. Wyatt stood tall amidst the scattered chairs. The exhaustion that usually weighed him down was completely gone, replaced by a terrifying, righteous fury. He looked down at Celeste, who was cowering in her seat, clutching her designer purse. Wyatt did not care about the hundreds of people watching. He stated loudly and clearly that he had seen the digital forensics. He told his wife he knew she had forged his signature. He told her he knew she had stolen his entire engineering startup fund to finance her mother's fraudulent parties. Celeste tried to reach for his hand, her face streaked with ruined makeup, sobbing a pathetic apology. Wyatt simply stepped back, entirely out of her reach. He slid the heavy gold wedding band off his left hand. He tossed it onto the signing table, the metal clattering loudly against the leather portfolio containing the fake documents. He declared that he was entirely done being their collateral damage. Without another word, he turned his back on the Voss family and walked out of the ballroom, leaving his parasitic marriage in the ruins of their empire. Mason finally shattered. The golden air was reduced to a pathetic, sweating mess. He grabbed the fabric of my dress, dropping his voice to a desperate, raspy whisper. He pleaded with me to go into the private hallway. He begged me to handle this in-house, away from the cameras, swearing he loved me and that they were just trying to survive. I smoothly pulled the silk fabric from his sweaty grip. I picked up the heavy silver pen Evelyn had so proudly presented to me earlier. I walked over to where Evelyn stood frozen, flanked by the fire marshals, watching her entire legacy burn to ash. I pressed the silver pen firmly into her trembling palm. I looked her dead in the eyes and delivered the final verdict. You did not prepare a wedding. You prepared a financial bailout using a bride as a corpse. Now, you have neither. I turned away from the altar. I gathered the heavy cascading skirt of my white gown and stepped down into the center aisle. The crowd parted for me instinctively, falling completely silent as I moved through them. I did not run. I did not lower my head, and I did not shed a single tear. I walked straight out the heavy wooden doors, leaving behind a family that had lost their money, lost their power, lost their victims, and permanently lost the right to ever control the narrative again. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.